Good evening, everyone. It's good to see so many of you here. And welcome to the Veritas Forum. Who of you has ever been to a Veritas Forum before? Okay, that's quite some people. So for those of you that are here for the first time, let me briefly explain what the Veritas Forum is. At the Veritas Forum, the bigger questions of life are discussed. Questions like, what is the purpose of life? Is there more that's in life that science cannot explain? Does a God exist? Such questions. And this year's edition is all about the big question, does science have all the answers? Tonight we have Professor Ard Louis from the University of Oxford and Dr. Dap Hartmann from TU Delft to discuss this big question with us. We seek at the Veritas Forum. We seek together for answers to these big questions, and we look at it from different perspectives, different beliefs, different worldviews. The moderator for tonight is Professor Hans Hellendoorn. He is Director of Education at the Faculty of Mechanical Engineering. And he's also the chair of the Cognitive Robotics department at the same faculty. So, Mr. Hellendoorn, I would like to invite you to introduce the speakers. I wish you a good evening and enjoy listening.
Yeah. Yeah, very nice to see so many people here. Welcome, everyone, and I hope we will have a very nice evening. So I've been myself to several of these meetings, and I have to say I enjoy that, because it is so important to understand how other people think. Yeah, and for me it was sometimes really an eye-opener, and I got much more understanding for other people, and I hope that will also apply to you, that tonight you will look with different eyes to the people and to have more understanding for other worldviews. We have two speakers here today, two persons. And the first is, I start with the external, that's what we should do, is Ard Louis. And he is a professor of theoretical physics at the University of Oxford, and he leads there an interdisciplinary research group that investigates scientific problems on the border between disciplines such as chemistry, physics, and biology. So there's a broad spectrum. And he's also director of the graduate studies in theoretical physics. He studied here in Utrecht. He also understands some more and even more Dutch, but or less and less. We should invite you more often here, but we have met each other several times here. But he studied in Utrecht and then did his PhD in Cornell University in the United States. Then the second speaker today is Dap Hartmann, and I have looked up. He was a student and PhD in astronomy in Leiden. Yeah, he got his PhD in Leiden also with William Butler Burton. And then he went to Harvard for 4 years in the United States. And later on he came back to Europe and went to Bonn, to the Max Planck Gesellschaft. And then later on he went here to the university. And he became at that time assistant professor for innovation management and entrepreneurship. And he also won a prize in 2010 for entrepreneurship. And I remember that very well because I also applied for the prize and I lost. And I remember that he won, and I was at that moment a little bit angry, but now I'm happy, so you really deserved it. And I meet Dap Hartmann often in the honors program because I'm also dean of the honors program of the university. And we have also met each other in Geneva. I want to make some advertisements. So this is a nice book written by Dap Hartmann on modern music, modern classical music. And really amazing what is in the book. Takes some time, yeah. So what I do is I read the chapter and then I'm listening to all the music, and then it goes very slowly, but then you enjoy it more. I want to ask Dap first to go to the lectern and present his view on this interesting topic.
Okay, thank you very much, Hans, for this kind introduction. By the way, I didn't even know that you competed for that prize. And I never applied for the prize. Somebody nominated me and made... I don't know. All right. Welcome all. Check the time. So the issue that we're going to discuss today is, does science have all the answers? No. Science does not have and never will have all the answers. I see there's a bit of time left over, so let me elaborate a little bit. First of all, a lot depends on what you consider to be an answer. What kind of proof or evidence do you require along with the answer? For instance, to answer the question, what is the origin of the universe? A religious person might answer, God created the heaven and the earth. And he or she can cite as a reference Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. The answer could even be supported by another reference, albeit from the same author. In 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in it. Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. That answer immediately triggers the next question. What is the origin of God? To answer the question, what is the origin of the universe, an astronomer would probably give you a different answer. 13.7 billion years ago, the universe started with an event referred to as the Big Bang. That answer immediately triggers the next question. What caused the Big Bang? One characteristic of a good scientist is to forever ask why, just like children do. That is why good scientists are very much like children, forever curious and never satisfied with a half-baked answer. Why? Richard Feynman was such a scientist. The titles of some of his books hint at the non-conformist approach to science. Surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman. Don't you have time to think? The pleasure of finding things out. What do you care what other people think? His 3-volume masterpiece, The Feynman Lectures on Physics, is treasured by every physicist I have ever met. In Volume 1, Chapter 7, The Theory of Gravitation, he asks a simple question. What makes a planet go around the sun? Feynman explains that in the days of Kepler and Galilei, some 400 years ago, one theory was that there were invisible angels behind the planet, beating their wings and pushing the planet along around the orbit. Now, how's that for an answer? Surprisingly enough, that answer is not far from the truth. The only difference is that the angels push in a different direction. And we call these angels the gravitational force. And we can calculate it very, very accurately. So it's not just the answer to the question, but also the method to verify and maybe even predict the answer. That's important. When is the next solar eclipse? That is a question that can be answered very accurately, which makes physics, or astronomy if you like, one of the few sciences that can make very accurate predictions. Verifiability is the essence of the scientific method. However, we still don't know really what gravitation is. Who are these angels? Ard is a physicist. I am an astronomer, at least I was during the first half of my academic life. Physics and astronomy are natural sciences, also referred to as hard sciences. Scientists in the hard sciences have answered numerous questions, such as what is the speed of light? What is the mass of a proton? How old is the universe? In 1900, the British physicist Lord Kelvin declared, "There is nothing new to discover in physics. All that remains is to more accurately measure its quantities." Soon after he said that, quantum physics and Einstein's theory of relativity emerged, completely revolutionizing and transforming physics. But then again, Lord Kelvin said a lot of things that sound pretty silly today. For instance, he said, "We will never ever see the far side of the moon." Yet there remain lots of unanswered questions in the hard sciences to which we hope to find an answer eventually. Questions such as, what happened to all the antimatter in the universe? Why does time seem to flow only in one direction? And how did life evolve from non-living matter? Questions in the social sciences, also referred to as the soft sciences, are quite different. For example, how can we induce people to look after their health? How can we aggregate information possessed by individuals to make the best decisions? And I picked this up from Twitter today. Are men who are dissatisfied with the size of their penis more likely to own guns? I actually read that paper, and surprisingly, the answer to that last question is exactly the opposite. In other words, people who own guns have enormous dicks. And then there are questions which, at least as far as I'm concerned, are outside the field of science. Questions such as, what is love? What is the most beautiful piece of music? And is there a God? Now, Richard Dawkins may be considered to be the Voldemort in this crowd, he who must not be named, defined a scale from 1 to 7 for the probability of the existence of God. And 1 indicates a strong theist, a 100% possibility of the existence of God. Or in the words of Carl Jung, I do not believe, I know. 2 is a very high probability, but not 100%. A de facto theist. I cannot know for certain, but I strongly believe in God, and I live my life in the assumption that He is there. Then you go down the scale and you arrive at 6, which is a very low probability, but still greater than 0. A de facto atheist. I cannot know for certain, but I think God is very improbable, and I live my life on the assumption that He's not there. Richard Dawkins himself said he was a 6 on the scale of 1 to 7. And then there's 7, strong atheist. I know there is no God with the same conviction as Carl Jung knows there is one. Now, just a quick poll. How many people here consider themselves a 7, a complete atheist? How many people consider themselves a 1, a complete theist? Okay. About a little dozen. Good. I myself am an atheist. Despite of what some people say, atheism is not another sort of religion. If you are not a fan of Manchester United, you are not a non-fan of Manchester United. Not being something very specific is not a category in itself. Fruit that is not a banana is not a non-banana. So I'm definitely not a theist, so that would make me an atheist. But I do not want to be labeled atheist, the same way that Groucho Marx said, I do not want to belong to any club that will accept people like me as members. So that would make me an atheist. Apart from the mathematical logic that a double negative is a positive, which implies that an atheist is a theist, and that too is a label. So actually I'm an ad infinitum atheist. I do not want to be labeled. However, according to a philosopher I once told this, I am labeled as someone who doesn't want to be in any category. It is reminiscent of the story of the scientist and the old lady. A scientist gave a lecture to a large audience about the history of the Earth, in which he explained that the Earth was formed billions of years ago from a cloud of cosmic dust, and that it revolved around the sun. After the lecture, an old woman came up to him and said, "Your theory that the sun is the center of the solar system and that the Earth is a ball which rotates around it sounds very convincing, but it's wrong." The scientist remained calm and friendly and asked her what her explanation was. She answered, "The Earth is a flat plane resting on the back of a giant turtle." Again, the scientist kept his cool and asked her, "If that is the case, what is the giant turtle standing on?" The woman responded, "I can see that you are a smart man for asking questions like that. So I'll tell you, the giant turtle stands upon the shell of another giant turtle." Now the scientist got a little annoyed and said, "Well, then what is that turtle standing upon?" Then the old lady looked at him and said, "Sir, you don't understand. It's turtles all the way down." The same problem arises when God is offered as an explanation for the creation of the universe. What then created God? Or is it God all the way down? Hopefully tonight's discussion will shed some light on this tantalizing question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dap and Ard. Yeah, please go to the lectern. Ard Louis.
Great, so thank you very much, Dap. That was a really interesting talk. Thank you to all of you for coming. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and to speak to you. Delft is a great university, and we're talking about a great topic, does science have all the answers? And like Dap, I'll do the same response. Myself. Thank you for reminding me.
How's this? Is it better? So thank you for, I'll start again. So thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here and to speak to you. Delft is a great university. Thank you, Dap, for your interesting and entertaining talk. The question that we actually seem to agree on is, does science have all the answers? To which our response is no. Nevertheless, I think that this idea floats around in our society and is either explicitly or implicitly quite a dominant one. So I want to talk about why it's remained dominant for so long, because I think it's intellectually vacuous. And so I'm going to talk about what I call zombie myths about science and faith. Zombie myths, zombies, you kill them and they come back up again, and you kill them, they come back again. And they feel a little bit like this. And so I'm going to talk about a few zombie myths about science and faith. And the first one is that science is the best avenue to truth about ultimate questions. Now, first of all, I say, I love science. I can't believe that I'm paid money to do science. It's amazing. It's not your money, because it's the British taxpayer mainly that pay. Although I guess my EU grants come from you as well. So thank you to those of you that pay taxes for indulging me in the joy of doing science. I think science should get funded a lot more than it does. I think science is probably the most important way we can better humanity. I think the advances of science are absolutely unbelievable. Science is the greatest thing that human beings have ever invented. I still don't think that science is going to answer all questions that we would like to put to it. So here I have Sir Peter Medawar, a famous Nobel Prize winner at Oxford, and an atheist, actually, who wrote, just before he died, in this book, that there is indeed a limit upon science is made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. These are the questions that children ask. The ultimate questions of Karl Popper, a famous philosopher. I have in mind such questions as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? And what is the point of living? It is not to science, therefore, but to metaphysics, imaginative literature, or religion that we must turn for answers to questions having to do with first and last things. So, what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example of such a question. How do I measure the value of a human being? This is a super important question to know an answer to, because this is something that matters for your day-to-day life. It matters for our collective lives. And you could ask the question, can science give us an answer to the value of a human being? Well, I'm going to be a bit facetious. Let's say if I was a chemist, how would I do that? Well, if you have gold fillings, you're clearly not worth more than someone without gold fillings, so that's not going to be the right axis on which to look. Maybe if I was a physiologist, I look at the size of your brain, or a psychologist, how smart you are, or an anthropologist, I might look at how the community values you. If an economist, I might look at how much economic value you produce. And sometimes I worry that our political overlords mainly think about us in that way. But none of those ways of thinking about what a human being is make very much sense. In fact, I would go even further and say, if you try to use this kind of science to try to calculate the value of a human being, you're doing something which is potentially even dangerous, because science always will find differences. I'm assuming that most of you, hopefully all of you in this room, will believe that human beings have intrinsic value. That value is independent of whether they're black or white, poor, rich, female, male. Think of any kind of distinction that we have between one another, that we have intrinsic value. Science will not give you that belief. That belief comes from somewhere else. And the only question is, if you believe that, do you have good reasons for believing that, or do you have not such good reasons? You just believe it because that's what you're told. And for this, I want to expand on this a little bit, because I'm assuming that most of you will believe that human beings have intrinsic value that's independent of where they come from. For Christians, this idea comes from the concept of God having created human beings and loving human beings, and therefore their value is extrinsic to them. Their value comes because they are loved by God, not by some intrinsic value that they have or some intrinsic property that they have. And that idea is widely held in our society because these ideas are deeply Christian, and we live in a society that's very much Christian. So even if you don't like it, you all think like Christians. I want to recommend this book by Tom Holland, which is called Dominion in English and Heerschappij in Dutch. And here's a little summary of what Holland's actually following. He's basically popularizing in historical and really kind of exciting writing Nietzsche, who says, "You may believe in human rights, in the equal dignity of every person, in the value of the poor and the weak, the necessity of caring and advocating for them all. You may believe that love is of great value and that you should forgive our opponents. You may still even believe in moral absolutes, that some things are good and some things are evil, and particularly that oppression of the powerless is wrong. The fact is, these are deeply Christian ideas. Historically, the Greeks, the Romans found them laughable. The shame and honor cultures of old pagan Europe, of the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, and the Germans, felt that the Christian ethic of forgiving one's enemies and of honoring the poor and the weak to be completely unworkable as a basis for society. My grandparents here in the Netherlands, my grandmother just passed away last year, actually. They were humanists, not just, they believed in humanism, but they were part of the humanist party, and they used to even have humanist meetings where they would go to. And I often sometimes thought to myself, well, I like those ideas, I agree with those ideas, but what's the basis of them? And they would just say, well, we just believe them because they're obviously true. And I asked myself, well, why are they obviously true? Well, just because they are. I think that's a really good set of ideas in which I agree, but I worry that kind of fideism, the idea that you just believe something because it's true without any basis of it, is terribly weak. I think effectively they were holding to deeply Christian values about human beings without actually understanding really well what the origin of those ideas were. And that brings me to actually a worry that I want to talk about, which is if secular humanism of this type, the kind of idea I just read out to you, derives not from reason or from science, but from the distinctive course of Christian's evolution. This is from Tom Holland on page 540 in the English version anyway. I don't know what page in Dutch. So if that's where these values come from, then how are its values anything more than a shadow of a corpse? What are the foundations of its morality, if not a myth? So I'm going to make an argument to you which basically goes as follows. Many of these ideas that you have about the value of human beings, the importance of taking care of the poor, the importance of helping the oppressed, are deeply Christian ideas. Historically, they would be laughable to many of the cultures in which Christianity first emerged. If you believe in those things, but you don't believe in Christianity, you need to find a good, solid, logical argument for where they come from. And if you can't, then you might ask yourself whether reductio ad absurdum, those ideas that you hold are correct or not. The fact is we are all philosophers and theologians. And on these big questions, like what is the value of a human being, what does it mean to live a good life, these are questions which science simply does not give an answer. That doesn't make science less strong or less powerful. It just is something that it can't answer. These are questions that you have fundamentally some other set of ideas for. And the point is that ultimate questions are harder than science, right? So I think science is great. You guys are lots of great scientists and engineers, but the really hard questions are these ones. What does it mean to be human? Is there a God? What is good and what is evil? And it's up to you to come up with a good, thoughtful way of adjudicating those questions and living your life that way. That's my first zombie myth, that science cannot answer ultimate questions. The second one is that scientists don't believe in God. This is a common public view. Interestingly, I sometimes people say to me, how could you be a scientist and believe in God? A little bit like as if I'm a vegetarian butcher. I sell you something I don't really believe in. Or perhaps even worse, I'm a pacifist soldier. Right? I look like something, but I'm actually dangerous to the cause. Well, in Oxford, I help run a course called Developing Christian Mind. It's aimed at Christian graduate students, so PhD students and master students, to help them think Christianly about their subject. And it's taught by maybe 100, 150 Oxford academics who teach on that course over the years. And interestingly, I've got lots of scientists to choose from, way more scientists than I have humanities scholars or social scientists. So empirically, there are a good number of scientists who believe in God. Whether that makes belief in God good or bad is, I think, a different question, but the fact that scientists don't believe in God is a zombie myth. The third zombie myth I want to cover is a kind of conflict metaphor for science and religion. And this is tied a little bit into some of the ideas that Tom Holland also talks about in his book. So the conflict myth is something like this. We had the Romans and the Greeks with all their glory. I think I was just in Athens a few weeks ago, and it's pretty amazing to see what they had done even 2,500 years ago. Then the barbarians came, Christians took over, there was the Dark Ages until the Enlightenment came in, and finally we kind of, brave individuals fought against the oppressive religious leaders, and thankfully we've been freed from all that. That's a very common view, and one of the ideas in that is that science emerged in conflict with religion. That's an interesting story. It's just simply not true. So here's Peter Harrison, who used to be in Oxford, now moved to Queensland. Those who argue for the incompatibility of science and religion will draw little comfort from history. The myth of a perennial conflict between science and religion is one to which no historian of science would subscribe. And Peter's one of the world's greatest historians of science. In fact, so strongly, this is a myth which is very strong. Pick up a newspaper, you'll find it all the time. Historians of science are so frustrated by it, they call it the conflict myth. And they've written a number of books. Here's my colleague Alan Chapman, who's actually a historian of astronomy, called Slaying Dragons. And here's a book called Galileo Goes to Jail, and another myth about science and religion, edited by Ron Numbers, which gives you a whole bunch of leading historians of science who talk about this. Now, they're not saying that the relation between science and Christian faith was always one of friendliness. Is a complicated relationship, but conflict is the wrong way of thinking about it. The next zombie myth I want to kind of touch on is that believing in God is like believing in a pink unicorn or a flying teapot. Flying teapot comes from Bertrand Russell. The pink unicorn has been popularized by Richard Dawkins. So here's the kind of way the argument runs. If you want to believe in teapots, unicorns, or tooth fairies, Thor or Yahweh, the onus is on you to say why you believe in it. The onus is not on the rest of us to say why we do not. We, who are atheists, are also afairists, ateapotists, and aunicornists. We don't have to bother saying so. Well, the problem with this argument is that the kind of God it's talking about is not the kind of God that I believe in. The point is, if I come to you and say, for example, I've discovered a new virus in my lab, okay? It's very amazing, okay? You have the right, and probably you should, be skeptical until I give you good evidence. You can be a new cool virusist until I give you evidence for it, and you can be skeptical for it. That is a good way of adjudicating those kinds of questions. But God is not a thing in this universe like us. God is not an animal like ourselves, only bigger and smarter and stronger. God is the reason for why the universe is here in the first place. And when you have something that's ontologically different like that, you've got to adjudicate questions about the existence of God in a different way. And so arguments like, is there a flying teapot that you can't see? Is there a pink unicorn at the bottom of your garden? Or all make a fundamental category mistake about what God actually is. So let me try to illustrate that with another example. Let me ask the question, why do we have the laws of nature? So people say, why is something rather than nothing? Why is our universe here? But those are all predicated on the question of why are the laws of nature here, right? We have a Big Bang. Those emerge from the laws of nature, the laws of physics. So where do those laws come from? Well, I think the first order, you've really got three different possibilities. One is that these laws of nature are eternal, so they've always existed. Okay, so they've always been there. And that may be true, but that's not something we've ever experienced in science. We have no science of things that have eternal existence. That's a philosophical answer. It's very odd, actually, if you start thinking about it, but it may be possible. I think the second possibility you have is that the laws of nature popped into being out of ontological nothingness. So the ontological nothingness is a fancy word for nothing, nothing. So not just vacuum, but no laws of nature, no laws of mathematics, no laws of logic. There was just nothing. And then suddenly the laws of nature popped into being. That's the second possibility that you have, right? Either the laws of nature have already existed, or some set of them have existed over time, but they've always existed, or they've popped into being out of nothingness. Now, those are both strange, peculiar ideas. But if you don't, those are two options you have. The third option is that the whole of space-time is dependent on a non-spatio-temporal reality, a necessary being. And this is the kind of God of classic theism, right? That the way you get around these two very odd questions is you posit there's something that's outside of space and time, something that cannot not exist. That's the God of theism. Right? And those are really your three options, right? And the point is, the kind of God you're talking about is not a God already inside the laws of nature. This is a God that is the cause, the ultimate cause, and the way of breaking this kind of Gordian knot of having things being eternal or popping into being out of nothingness. Now, my point is, all three of these options are strange. Right? All three of these options are philosophical. You've got to probably first order choose one of these three and ask yourself which of these is the best one. And the question would be, how would you weigh evidence for these three kind of options? And here I quote John Polkinghorne, who a famous theoretical physicist at Cambridge and also a theologian, who said, if we were to understand the nature of reality, we have two possible starting points. Either the brute fact of the physical world or the brute fact of a divine will and purpose behind that physical world. That's a fancy way of saying either you've got the first two options, there's just the natural world, nothing else, or there's some kind of will and purpose, a non-material being that is the first cause, the ultimate cause of what we see. And you might ask yourself, how do you adjudicate questions like that? You don't adjudicate them like you adjudicate questions about fancy viruses or pink unicorns. You have to think more carefully. And the difficulty is that basically, this is for those of you that are Bayesians, right? So the probability of theism given the evidence is in Bayes' theorem, right? Written as the probability of theism, which is extremely hard to adjudicate, times the evidence, which is the probability of the evidence given theism. And the same at the bottom, I've got the probability for atheism, given some evidence, is the a priori probability of atheism, which is hard to adjudicate, and the probability of evidence given atheism. And so some people call this the Bayes factor, and the question of if the Bayes factor is larger than 1, then the probability for theism is larger, or is enhanced by that evidence. You don't know what the absolute priors are. And if it's less than 1, then it's less. So I'll give you one or two examples. So one very surprising aspect of our natural world is that it's uniform. That means if I do an experiment in Oxford under good conditions, then I will get somebody in Cambridge does experiment under the same conditions, at least if they're smart, they should get the same results. And that's actually really surprising that the universe should be uniform. One of the arguments the historians make is that it was precisely a theological understanding of a God behind the universe that allowed people to make the really big jump that the world would be uniform. And that's what. So basically, uniformity is one of the. It's actually very surprising on atheism that you'd have uniformity. You wouldn't expect it necessarily. So the next one I might give is there's a whole bunch of other arguments of this type you can make, and all of them effectively, I think, are enhance at least the probability of theism. There are problems that actually enhance the probability of atheism, and suffering is a classic example of that. The fact that we seem to see a lot of needless suffering in our world, physical suffering, and that actually, on balance, I think lowers the probability of theism. So really, to end, we're all philosophers and theologians. Science actually has remarkably little to say about the ultimate questions that we all care about, that we should care about. And really, for you as rational people, you should think very hard about where you get your ideas from. You all have a theory about what is good and what is wrong. You have a theory about what it means to live a good life. You'll have some set of ideas where that comes from. I believe that it's very rational to ground those ideas in God, in not just in a vague God, but in the God of the Bible, revealed to us most explicitly in Jesus Christ. And that question really for you is that a good way of grounding it, or do you have a better way of grounding it? What you can't do is assume that somehow you don't need to ground it, and you can just kind of, bubble around in your life and not really think about it. You need to think about it and make a good decision. And my last point is simply that, science is hard and fun, but the really hard questions are these big questions, and I'm really looking forward to chatting to Dap about them after this. So thank you very much.
Yeah, please take a seat. So what we did, we asked both speakers to have questions for each other, and I start with a question from Ard to Dap, and then I will do a question from Dap to Ard. And the first question from Ard to Dap is, did you ever have a period in your life when you believed in God?
No.
No.
I realize that's a very short answer.
Yes.
But it's hard to elaborate other than I wasn't exposed to religion and I didn't know any religious people until I was about 10 years old, when I had to stay with next door neighbors for a couple of days, well, maybe for a full week, because my father was in the hospital and my mother had to be there. And so we lived with them, and they were very religious. That was my first exposure to that. And I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. However, they said the Our Father every night before dinner, and I still remember it. So it did make some impact, but no, I've never ever believed in God or saw the urge, the necessity to do so.
Okay. The next is a question from Dap to Ard. And that is a hard question. To which question would you never want to know the answer?
Yeah, this is I have actually quite a few. I've thought about this for a while. I don't have a simple answer because I actually started thinking. On the one hand, as a scientist, you want to know the answers to all questions. On the other hand, I realize in my relational life there are definitely answers. There's questions I would not want to know the answer for. Like, for example, I'm married, and I realize there are questions that I could ask my wife that I wouldn't want to know the answer to. These might include previous boyfriends that she's had. It could include thoughts she might have of other kinds about me. And I realize actually there's something about relationships, particularly romantic, very deep relationships, where a little bit of mystery is actually a really good thing. And so I realize there's actually things about her that it's funny because I really want to get to know her better, but there's certain things I actually don't want to know. That maybe I raised this big film, so I'm feeling a little bit embarrassed.
May I
Yeah, follow up.
comment on that? I can see your point, but those are hardly the big questions in life, right? So I was really referring to the big questions in life. And let me give you an example that I sometimes ask people. If you could know the exact day at which you're going to die, without any doubt, and there's nothing you can do about it, would you want to know?
So I've thought about this question because in kind of bioethics, this becomes alive. If I have my genome, not quite that accurate, but I could have my genome tested, and it might tell me the diseases that might kill me at certain ages and give me some of this. And I think on good days, I think I would like to know that answer so that I could plan my life around it. And on other days, I think maybe I don't want to because what if it's a bad answer? What if I've got some genetic deformity and I'm going to die soon? My children will grow up without me. I might get very depressed.
But you can't unknow once you know it.
Yeah, exactly. But I think so. When you get genetic testing, they offer you this. They say, "Would you like to know or not know?" And I think I would like to know. So I have been genetically tested for. So I've got family history of bowel cancer. So I was genetically tested for bowel cancer, and I thought actually I really want to know if I have that gene or not. The results were inconclusive. But actually, I thought that I want to know. The reason I want to know that is because if I have that gene, so if I may not have the gene, but I don't have the genes that they were looking for, so that's probably good news. But if I had the bad news, then I want to have it checked on a regular basis. But I would like to know probably. So the reason I'm hedging is because I think part of me says yes, I would like to know, and part of me worries that if I did know, it might be worse than not knowing.
Good.
Courageous. The next question is a question from Ard to Dap. Why do you think, and it is a turtle question, I would say, why do you think there is something rather than nothing?
Well, I think that's one of the ultimate questions in the universe, in life. Nobody has any idea.
Yeah.
I know that some of you have a theory about this revolving around a certain deity. Physically speaking, I have no clue. So if evoking a deity for the answer helps you, gives you peace of mind, that's fine with me. That just doesn't help me. So I have no idea why there is something instead of nothing. It's mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling, yeah.
Can drive people crazy. But then again, why is the universe so incredibly big? It's so unbelievably big. I mean, I'm an astronomer, And you'd think that I'd be used to how big the universe is. I can't even imagine, how big it is. Why is it so incredibly big?
And so old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I'm also old. I'm also pretty big.
No.
No, I think the fact that the universe is gigantically big,
Yeah.
unimaginably big, and unimaginably old, or Earth is unimaginably old. I think those are kind of amazing facts about the world. And certainly, as an astronomer, you're struck.
So you're not of the school of the 5,000 years. You're really of the 30.7 billion years.
Yes, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's 13.7, something of that nature. And I think that I think most Christian scientists would find that unproblematic.
Yes.
I think so. As a Christian, I think a little bit like this: if you look at the complexity of the universe and the beauty of it, the intricacy of it, it points to a God. And if you're going to assume that there is a God that created this world, who must be extremely powerful and very subtle, because the universe is very beautifully put together. And it'd be very surprising if that God were to make a small universe just for us. There must be something about grandeur. So I even think there's, on that grounds, I think theologians have argued there may be many universes on the grounds of the glory of God. And it's interesting, if you like children's books, C.S. Lewis wrote this Narnia series, and in the last series there's a heaven kind of scene where they go into heaven. And in that heaven, you go over a valley into a new valley, and there's always a new one. It doesn't ever stop. It keeps going on forever. And that was, I think, his way of trying to portray this idea that if there is a God, this God is going to be creating something beautiful and extraordinary, which is what we see.
I have a next question for you, Ard, because you were now answering your own question. That is not...
Sorry. I thought the questions were supposed to be discussion.
But
yeah.
we allow you. Is there anything that could cause you to lose your faith in the existence of God?
For sure. So if we found the body of Jesus Christ, in some way we could 100% sure that it was the case, it didn't rise from the dead, then that would be the end of my faith. Empirically, that would be the end. So, I think it's important for people's religious belief to be empirically falsifiable. Otherwise, it's not that valuable.
I've never heard that answer before. I'm frankly a bit surprised. I don't know much about religion, but isn't the body sort of insignificant? Isn't it about the spirit? So even if you find the body, isn't the spirit still in heaven? So what?
Yes, I think that would be. But that's a good question. So I think in the Christian story, the idea that Jesus rose from the dead, physically rose from the dead, is critical to the whole story. The idea would be that, in fact, it says. The writer Paul says, if Christ is not raised from the dead, we are to be pitied above all men. In other words, if we're wrong about this, then that's really sad for us. And so it's not just that this is some kind of spiritual, vague thing. It's like the Bible tells us that Jesus Christ literally rose from the dead. Therefore, if his body were to be found today, or some way we could identify it, that would be the end. We'd be wrong. I would be pitied. Yeah.
I'm sensing a new novel by Dan Brown coming.
Then a third question to Dap, and the question is: do you believe in ethical facts? Do you believe that there is good and evil? There is an example here, for example, torturing children for pleasure is always wrong. I think most would agree. And if so, what grounds all these ethical facts?
Well, obviously, I believe in ethical facts. And what grounds do I have? I think it's so natural, and it comes out of empathy and out of your experience with other beings to sort of do not unto others what you don't want to be done to yourself. Mm-hmm. I think that's the first natural experience that you would have, even without religion, even though I know it's a sort of a religious point of view. And my counter argument will be, of course, you try to find something very horrific like torturing children. Just simply killing people wouldn't be enough of a deterrent, but that's okay. Yet, you know, if you look at the Ten Commandments, there's nothing about not torturing children. There is one, the fifth, like, I don't know if they're in order of importance, but the fifth one says, "Thou shalt not kill." And I believe it was George Carlin who said, really, you had to engrave that on a stone tablet for people to remember? You couldn't come up with that yourself? It's so important that you put it on a stone tablet. Yet that's one of the few really ethical things. There's nothing about torture. So why is that one in the Ten Commandments and not some other things? And another argument I would have is, I strongly believe that there are people who are just pure evil. There's very little we can do about it. And these people will do these things. Mm-hmm. And we, as non-evil people, recognize that. And that's also how you get your moral ground. And I don't believe that animals torture other small animals for fun. They do horrible things that we may think of as torture, but not for the pleasure, to pleasure themselves to do it. So were they also instructed by God then not to do that, or?
Can I tell you a story?
Good.
So when I grew up in Gabon in Central Africa, and we had a chimpanzee as a pet. So the story is we lived in the village, and there the meat came from the forest, so they shot his mother, which they normally wouldn't do if they saw a baby, but they didn't see him because they hold on to their stomach. So he was a few weeks old, we got him, and we raised him first with a bottle, and then as he got older, slowly got stronger, and so he was in our back garden. And I remember very clearly as a child once, the little goat came down underneath, and he waited in the tree and then pounced on it and killed it. And pounced on it, began playing with it, then killed it, and began poking out its eyes, and had enormous pleasure. Actually, he did this with numerous other animals, and so he seemed to derive pleasure from torturing these animals. And so as a child, I remember thinking to myself, why is he doing this? Is he evil? Is he responsible for this behavior? It's an interesting question. So I think animals do sometimes torture for pleasure. Bertje, who's his name, little Bert, Bertje, did do this.
Okay.
So
Then if I'm permitted, I want to make another small point. I mean, the obvious question is, I try to avoid many of the common places, like, you know, I don't want to get into why did God allow Auschwitz and stuff like that. However, we all agree that torturing children does exist. It happens. Mm-hmm. And the obvious question there too is, why would God allow that? But I'm not going to ask it. I'm going to put it in a different context. Do you have children?
Yes.
Do you have pets?
No.
Okay. Suppose you had a pet cat, and you would observe one of your children seriously torturing that cat. Would you intervene?
Yes.
Okay. Then the question remains, why doesn't God intervene? If, you know, you wouldn't say, like the argument that I always hear is, well, God gave people their own responsibility. Sort of, why don't you give your son the same own responsibility?
It's a very good question. It's a very hard question. Yesterday, my daughter, who's 9, wanted to cut her own baguette with a knife that we tell her she normally isn't allowed to use. And I saw that happening in the morning. And then I thought, what should I do? Should I intervene and tell her not to do so? Or should I just leave her? Which I did. She promptly cut her finger and began to howl. And so that is the opposite reaction, right? Which is, I realize it's not going to do me any good to keep grabbing the knife away from her. She's going to have to learn from her experience that knives are sharp and that you should be careful with them. And how to do that well is a very difficult thing as a parent. The argument about why God allows evil is much more complex than how we parent. But the fundamental argument goes a bit like this. If I were to create, let's say, a being, a robot, like our you would, and let's say I train that robot to always say, Ard, I love you. Ard, you're great. That would be not real, right? Because that robot would not have a choice. I've created that. I have to somehow, for that to be real, that robot has to have a choice to also turn against me. And so one of the ideas is that God has created human beings with these kinds of choices, including choices to turn away from him. Otherwise, the love isn't real.
Yeah, but as a last remark, maybe.
Yeah.
Here, God is not the victim for you, leaving him. Some other one of his creatures is the victim.
Well, I understand. I'm just telling you why, on balance, Christians tend to think that for personal evil of this kind, or evil that's caused by other human beings, the good of autonomy is higher, aggregated, than the good of God intervening and breaking things.
Okay, I have the last question from Dap to Ard, and then there is also room for the questions from the audience. So please think already if you have a question. Did God create people, or did people create God?
Well, I think it's a good question. So, as a Christian, I obviously believe that God created the whole universe, including us, and that's super important. I believe that is the most clear and parsimonious explanation of a lot of what we see around the world, including the fact that science works, the fact that human beings have intrinsic value. Having said that, I think human beings also create all kinds of gods. And those can be vague gods that they kind of worship and they follow, or very concrete ones that they might make statues over. I studied in Central Africa, where there were many, many gods, river gods, tree gods, all kinds of gods. And so if you read the Bible, it actually talks a lot about you should not follow other gods. Like, people create other gods, and these are not real gods. So I believe that both of these things are true. And the fact that human beings create other gods is not surprising that they would do so. It doesn't necessarily negate or even count as very strong evidence against the idea that there may be a true God. It just happens to be a property of the world.
Okay, no follow-up questions. Then I look at the audience. There's a microphone. You have it. So if someone has a question, then please raise your hand or stand up, and then the microphone is heading in your direction. Please say your name and then...
Okay, first of all, my name is David. Thank you both for your talk. I have a question for Dap. You mentioned that you believe that some people are pure evil. Does that also imply that you believe in pure good?
No, I don't believe in pure good. And pure evil, of course, nobody is pure evil, but some people are capable of incredibly cruel and evil deeds. So pure evil is not that the person is that person would maybe torture children, but does good.
It's a good father.
Takes good care of his dog. Yeah. So pure is, you shouldn't take that too literally. But if you do something so heinous, as mentioned before, then I think pure evil applies to you, even though you may have some good traits, but they don't compensate in any way. Pure good, same thing. There are people who are incredibly good, but even the Mother Teresa wasn't all good. Let's put it mildly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there in the back there is a question.
Hi, my name is Jacob Ard. Thanks for your talk. I also have a question for Dap. So you said you believe there are people that are pure evil. If I'm reminding myself correctly, you also say you don't see in the animal kingdom that there are animals that torture other animals for pure pleasure. So what's the difference between humans and animals, that humans are capable of torturing for pleasure and animals aren't?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And Art just told an example that points to the opposite of what my view on the whole thing is. Maybe it's because this was a chimpanzee, right? It's so close to a human being that it's almost like, you know, maybe it was God's human 0.1 attempt. I don't know. Please tell me if it's blasphemous what I'm saying. But hey.
No.
So to get back to your question, I don't know. It's the same question why humans can develop mathematics, and as far as we know, animals can't. It has something to do with higher brain functions being able to make other kinds of decisions than pure. For most animals, I would attribute this to survival instincts, and they're not wired to do these things. You know, maybe also out of evolutionary survival. If you're that bad, then it's not good for the species, so that won't survive. It's sort of the selfish gene theory of the aforementioned Richard Dawkins. But I don't really have an answer to your question. But thanks anyway.
Yeah, there are two questions there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. My name is Wijnand, and I actually have to disagree. I think animals are capable of torturing other animals, well, but they might not realize it. For example, I had a cat, and she would just play with the mouse all day, bring him inside, play with him all day. But I don't think the cat really realizes what she was doing. But I do think animals are capable of torturing other animals for fun. So that's not that doesn't only apply to humans, I believe.
Yeah, it's a good point in the sense that, yeah, for fun, you know, if you don't immediately kill the animal, the mouse, play with it forever, that is clearly hurtful. But the question is, you know, the essence is, I think, do you realize what you're doing and that it's hurtful? And for humans, I would imagine that they would realize that, even though some people are maybe not even capable of that much empathy that they realize how bad it is. But I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but maybe Art has a view on this, having experienced this.
No, I told you the story about my chimpanzee simply because it's I remember finding it very disconcerting as a child that he would do this. I think the point that you raise is how aware is it, you know, what's the moral awareness of an animal and what's its responsibilities are difficult questions. It's maybe a little bit of a distraction to talk about whether animals do or do not torture for pleasure. I think the interesting point is this. I give that example because it's a bit of a strong one. If we believe that this is true, then it also gives us certain obligations. For example, if we see another person doing this, to intervene. And the really interesting question always is, once we start saying that we believe there are these moral facts and that we have access to them, these are two different steps. So you might believe there are moral facts, but that evolutionary processes don't give you access to them. There's a very famous argument against moral realism by Sharon Street, philosopher, on this. It's called Evolutionary Argument Against Moral Realism. If there are moral truths that are true, independently of whether I believe them or not, why would an evolutionary process give me access to them? But I think the point, which I completely agree with you, is that instinctively we sense that these things are true. And where the rubber hits the road is that we look around at ethical systems that human beings do. If you look historically, then some of these ideas that we now hold to be obviously true would not have been held by the Romans or the Greeks or our predecessors. And so many of the ideas that I believe that you probably hold would be deeply Christian ideas. So the question then is, if these are deeply Christian ideas, that's where their origin comes from. If you believe Christianity is true, there's no problem. But if you don't believe Christianity is true, then you have a kind of two problems. One is you have to find a justification for these beliefs, and that's hard. In fact, there's the Enlightenment project of trying to find these justifications hasn't worked, and so we don't have them outside of these kinds of religious assumptions, and that raises all kinds of very difficult questions. So I'm arguing that if you believe that, for example, human beings have intrinsic value, then you can ground that on theism. I actually think that hardcore atheism erodes that idea very quickly. And then the choice that you have is to either believe that idea isn't really true, or perhaps to believe that your premises aren't true.
Okay. Okay. Can I just ask Art another question that just popped up? I mean, I'm not as well, familiar with all the religious concepts, but I believe that you are Christians and you believe that Jesus Christ is your God and not his Father. Is that right?
No, Christians believe that God is a Trinity, so 3 in 1.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
but
because does God love everyone,
yes,
including the person who tortures children?
yes,
That's kind of weird.
it is.
Because in the Trinity, the little that I read about the Old Testament, that's one, that was not a very nice person. If you did something let's assume it's a he, didn't like, he would kill you, your whole family, and the city you lived in, and maybe the neighboring city. So what happened? So all of a sudden, even if you torture children, you're being loved. And in the Old Testament, if you did, I don't know, slept with somebody else's wife, they would destroy you, your whole family, into the 3rd generation and the city. So what changed?
Well, so this is a famous question, which is why was there development in the way that God related to human beings? And what you see is basically a series of kind of covenants that God made with human beings over time that accumulated in Jesus Christ. So Jesus came, and he often said things like, for example, in the law, which is the word for the Old Testament, certain things were allowed, certain things were not allowed. I've come to fulfill them and to tell you what they really were about. And so before that, you were given these quite harsh and sometimes fairly binary laws because of the hardness of your heart. But you had to wait until Jesus came to show the fulfillment of them. So the idea that there's development in what human beings could interact with. And so the question of so I think the name for the thing that you're talking about, which is what happened in the Old Testament when there was violence, sometimes in the name of God, is called the problem of genocide. It's one of the biggest problems that Christians have to struggle with. St. Augustine, probably the greatest theologian of the post-Christ, really, for many years was a Manichaean, didn't believe in the Bible on those grounds. He thought there were ethical problems with the Bible because of the genocide passages. So it's not a new question. And the argument, it's a difficult question. The argument, the first order, is that sometimes although these commands are relatively less developed than what we'd have in Christ, what they're basically telling us is that God does really care about good and evil. And these are manifestations of that fact that there is good and there is evil, and it has consequences, and it does matter. It's not just all, oh, you're doing something evil, but I love you anyway. It's like these are bad things, and you need to stop them. That's the argument. Okay. There's a lot of literature on this, and it's not new, but it's interesting to think about.
Oh, I didn't dare pretend that I had an original question here, but...
Well, it's a good question. It's a very good...
Are there any more questions from the audience? Yes, several. Oh, yeah. We start here, and then, So we should have some shorter answers, because otherwise we will not make it.
I'm Vlad, and my question is somewhere in between religion and science, because it implies both belief and laws of nature that are more or less yet discovered. So I'd like to know your opinion about aliens and living in a simulation.
Yeah.
Was the question addressed to me?
For both of you.
To both.
Yeah.
Oh.
Aliens.
Okay. Short answer, I'm pretty positive, pretty sure that life elsewhere in the universe exists, if only for the fact that the universe is so incredibly big. Second answer, which is for most people more relevant, have aliens visited us? No.
Some say only the United States.
Only if
Well, you
you're-
worked with Avi Loeb.
I've worked with Avi Loeb.
Yeah.
Well, he doesn't say that aliens exist, but he sees pieces of debris that could be spaceships. Yeah, it could be spaceships. Could also be interstellar candy. I don't know.
As you guys say, I don't have any strong opinion about whether aliens do or don't exist. I think could be not. So far, I don't think there's any evidence for them. And what was your second question again? It was aliens and do we live in a simulation? Exactly. So actually, Nick Bostrom, who until recently was at Oxford, has just been booted out. It's a famous paper on do we live in a simulation? I think the answer is no. I don't think we live in a simulation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
So-
There was a question there.
I was asked for short
Yeah.
answers. There is no short
the
answer.
blue
To that.
shirt,
There is no short answer to that question. But I do believe that there's good reason. Just like I believe, maybe I'll say a very short answer. So let me give it another version of that. Simulation is a famous philosophical question that you'll get in kind of philosophy 101. Is how do I know that you are a really independent person? That there's not some kind of big conspiracy going on. Yeah. And the real fact is, so how do I know that there are other minds? Mm-hmm. It's very famous, probably the most famous Christian philosopher of the last century, Alvin Plantinga's first book is called God and Other Minds. And the point of the argument is that I believe that you have an independent other mind, even though I actually can't prove it in any kind of reasonable way. Yeah? It's unprovable, but I believe it's nevertheless true. And he says, I think, and we all believe that we're rationally justified in having that belief. In the same way, he is trying to argue that there are certain ideas about our belief in God that can be rationally justified in a similar kind of way. So that's a slightly longer answer. And I think that the simulation argument runs the same way. But God and Other Minds, great classic from the 1950s.
Yeah, next question.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Siep, and I have a question for Ard. And I heard you agree with the idea that the universe is 13.7 billion years old, and also with maybe on aliens. So my question is, where do you draw the line in what you take literally from the Bible? Especially since like the Bible and God says, this is my word in its entirety and you cannot take anything away from it. Yeah. So I'm just curious about that.
It's a very good question. So I 100% believe that the Bible is the literal truth that God gave to us. I think that means that we should read it carefully in its context. And so I think if you look at the Genesis passage, for example, I don't think any reasonable literary reading of it would have this to be historical. As opposed to, say, Luke, who starts, I'm writing this to his friend Theophilus, an orderly account of what I've seen, which is clearly some kind of proto-history. Genesis clearly is not. And the reason is, it's obvious from the text. For example, the writer says, there was morning and evening the first day, morning and evening the second day, morning and evening the third day, morning and evening the fourth. On the fourth day, God created the sun, the moon, and the stars. Okay? You don't have to be a modern scientist to realize you don't have morning and evening without the sun, the moon, and the stars. And in fact, the words that are used there for sun and moon are not the proper name, sun and moon, but rather greater lamp and lesser lamp. What that author is actually saying is something which makes a lot of sense in that context, and maybe not so much in ours. The author is saying the sun and the moon are not living beings who have their own names, whom you worship, because astrology was the dominant paradigm at the time. They are lights, like the things in your tent. They're physical objects. That was a scientific kind of argument, and there was no evidence for it. That was a theological argument, really, but it could be adjudicated. It could have been the case that sun and moon were actually living beings that control our lives. It turns out that they're not. From our perspective, this seems completely so obvious that we don't even notice that this is in the text. And so my point is, when you read the text, you need to be careful and read it for what it is and ask yourself, what is it saying? I'm just giving you one example here with the first days. Right? So I think that in some Christian circles, there is an emphasis that you need to believe that this is somehow proto-history, it's some kind of journalistic text. Otherwise, you're not taking the Bible seriously. I think that is a modern heresy. Yeah. It doesn't take the Bible seriously enough. And I'll give you an example to push that even further, I grew up in Gabon, in Central Africa. We lived in a village. There were lots of people, older generation, that had not been educated, that came from a really traditional tribal background. One of the really interesting things about how they talked about things and they told stories was they would often tell stories in non-chronological ways. That means they would tell something in a way that wasn't the order in which it happened. And the reason for that was not because they were not educated. These were very intelligent people. They were trying to make a very subtle point, very deep points, by the way they told stories. In our modern Western world, we've lost that ability. Except we have poetry, which is kind of meaningless, or we have prose, which is supposed to be like journalistic text. And so it's a kind of chronological snobbery to look back at these people and think that they weren't as really sophisticated in how they were telling stories, and therefore to try to understand what they were trying to do. So I actually think you take the Bible more seriously by looking at what it says and realizing what it's saying, and realizing that you shouldn't take that text as being anything like proto-history. Once you realize that, then there's many different ways that the science could have happened that are all consistent with that text, including the fact that the universe is probably 13.7 billion years ago, at least if Dap's astronomy colleagues are correct.
Well, the last time I looked.
Last time you looked, okay.
Next question. Yeah, there on the side. And then after that in the very back, yeah, so someone's really pushing.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I have a question for Dap. Why do you believe there is something rather than nothing?
I think it was more or less the question.
Yeah, we had that question
Ard asked
already.
me. I don't know. I think that's the most profound question in all of existence. And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. But if you have your own favorite theory, not based on scientific facts, that's fine with me.
But I would say we had this question already,
Yeah.
so please let's...
Can I maybe rephrase it? Maybe?
we don't know. Oh, sorry, you will do it.
Okay. So I would put it more in the context. The universe is so complex and but also imbalanced. Why do you think there is balance instead of chaos in the universe?
Well, the simple answer would be otherwise the universe wouldn't be there. I mean, it's the same question why all the constants of nature are exactly aligned to be what they are, because if they were like a fraction different, the universe would not exist. Well, there's your explanation. Maybe there were so many gazillion tries, and finally the constants of nature aligned for the universe to be able to exist. I don't know, it's just a hypothesis, but the fact that it is the way it is proves that it can exist. However, as I pointed out in my little introduction, there are still a lot of mysteries. I mean, if we believe that the universe was created and that equal amounts of matter and antimatter, were formed, where is all the antimatter? We don't know.
All right, thank you.
And then in the back, thank you for the question.
Thank you. So this is questions for Daps. Similar to the last question, assuming we all agree that there is chaos before everything, and just would like to know why everything comes from chaos into order, into Earth, like into the beauty we can appreciate, and because if we leave dirty dishes into the sink, it will keep dirty. It has to, get someone to get them clean. So, yeah.
Okay, I think I understand your question a little bit. There appears to be some order, and that is a physical fact that gravity just attracts stuff, so we get these beautiful spherical objects, planets and stars, and it seems to be less chaotic than it can be. However, as most physicists and astronomers believe, eventually everything will end up in chaos anyways. I mean, that's just the laws of thermodynamics as far as we know them. So yes, eventually the universe will end up more dirty than your dirty dishes in the sink. Just complete chaos.
But I think the order also includes the materiality among humans, like the law of nature, those things. So it's just like I would assume it would come from the God of Bible, and it leads to the earth and the reality where we have. Sorry, it's just my opinion.
Okay.
Any more questions? Yeah, there is probably, and then, yeah, there in the back probably there is also someone all the time winking a bit. Sorry, so we cannot. Daniel.
Yeah, I have a question for Ard. Because when you ask a question, so the question about is there anything that would make you doubt the existence of God or make you doubt, and you had an easy answer, but I was wondering if I could rephrase your question and ask, is there anything that makes you doubt that is yet unknown but that could be discovered, and the two of you, because presumably Jesus' bones, there's a very low probability that we can provide that to you. So is there anything that could be discovered and that the two of you could factually agree that yes, this is, that would make you doubt? And if you have a short answer, then maybe you can answer the same on your side. Is there anything that is yet to be discovered and that could be discovered and that two of you would factually agree on that could make you agree, that could make you change your mind regarding the existence of God?
Huh. That's a good question. So the ones about, I guess I gave the example of the bones of Jesus Christ being found because it's central to the Christian story. I agree with you that the problem, if you were to find those bones, would be how would you even prove that where they came from? Maybe another example that would falsify my faith would be somehow showing that something very fundamental about how the Bible was formed, showing that it actually is written by somebody completely different than what we think, or something of that nature. I'd have to think really hard about what that would be. Perhaps that would be another falsifiable thing. I mean, I think there's many things that would be, that in principle, falsifiable. The interesting thing is that there's an enormous amount of good evidence for the biblical texts that makes it extremely unlikely that this event would be true, but it could be true. Right, so extremely good evidence for these kind. So it's hard to. So again, like the bones of Christ, this is a little bit of a different problem. The problem isn't that it would be hard to adjudicate the evidence. The problem is that the evidence to the contrary is pretty overwhelming, and it'd be hard to see what would overthrow it.
Do you also want to?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and for the longest time, the question was not phrased as you do it, which is more subtle, which made me think. So I've actually come up with an answer for that. The usual question is, what would make you believe in God? And assuming that God would like me to believe in God, I always say something like, okay, turn the Eiffel Tower upside down tomorrow at noon. If that happens, I'm a believer, because I cannot explain that any other way. Now, that's sort of the short answer, because that's easy, but God doesn't want me to believe in in God. But you asked me if something could be found. That's an interesting question. And I think God missed his first opportunity to make me a believer by writing a Bible that doesn't contain anything that people 2,000 years ago didn't know already. So my answer to your question would be, if some scripture were found with things that are so completely new to us and that turn out to be right about new scientific theories, about technology, about things that are unbelievable, then there's two theories. Either, it's the Word of God, or it's aliens who put them there. So then we still have to distinguish. but something that we don't know about, and the only source could be some intelligence that is much superior to what we are, and one explanation could be God, and the other one could be aliens.
Yeah. Here's someone. Oh, yeah. I have to make a choice. Sorry.
So why believe everything got aligned and now we live in a balanced world? What if the world we live in is actually chaos? Because as we can see in this very moment, we're full of questions, doubts, and uncertainty.
Who's this question addressed to? Both?
Both of you. I mean, mostly you though, because you said that things turned from chaos to balance. But I think we live in chaos right now more than balance.
Well, what do you mean we live in? Do you mean on planet Earth? Do you mean in the universe?
Yeah, our existence, however you see it. Your existence, my existence are different somehow, but we're part of this planet, even we like it or not.
Well, we humans are capable of creating chaos against the laws of thermodynamics. We can create a airplane which wouldn't exist, out of sheer chance. We're even better capable of creating chaos. We are so good at destroying everything we ever created. And I think we're well on the way of destroying the entire planet Earth. Well, maybe not, but at least for ourselves, which may be a good thing. If anything, planet Earth needs less people. Planet Earth is doomed unless we get rid of the people. The planet will be perfectly okay without us.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, like any other animal or a species will flourish without.
Yeah.
Art.
So I think when people talk about the order and chaos, what they're really talking about is the laws of nature and the fact that we live in what's effectively a very low entropy state compared to what you could imagine, and that's surprising. So one of the things about the origin of our own universe, a physics question, is why do we start with such a low entropy state? And what physicists basically agree on, this is one of many surprising things about our natural world that Dap also refers to, something called fine-tuning. So there's many constants of nature that are slightly different. You wouldn't have the kind of ordered universe that you have, and the kind of universe that allows life to appear. Now, it's obviously true that if it wasn't that way, we wouldn't be around. Okay, but I think the surprising thing with some of these laws of nature, you could also imagine a set of laws. You could imagine the following scenario where many versions of these constants, many values of these constants, would still give you life-generating universes. But it seems like life-generating universes, like the one that we live in, are a very small fraction of the phase space of possibilities. So one option would be the one Dap mentioned, that you would have an infinite number of universes, a multiverse. If you tried enough times, you'll finally happen upon ours. But an infinite number of something doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get anything. So if I give you an infinite number of odd numbers, none of them are divisible by 2. So even theories of the multiverse, so many universes, need certain structure in them to allow them to make universes like ourselves, which are ordered universes that make life. And so one of the very surprising things about, when we talk about chaos and order, we're not talking about our own lives, political issues, social issues, the things that we might do or not doing to the planet. We're talking about the fact that we live in a universe that allows conscious human beings like ourselves to exist. It's extremely remarkable, very surprising. And obviously, if you believe in God, it's not surprising that there would be fine-tuning of this world, because that's what we believe God would want. And so it's like, in my Bayes factor argument, it's something that increases the evidence, the probability of theism.
Just sir in the back, yeah, probably that is the last question, because otherwise we are sent out of the building during the discussion.
Hi, so this is primarily a question for Ard. So basically, why a Christian God? Were you ever inclined to explore other theological ideas? And if yes, what made you come back to Christianity? And if no, why not, basically?
So that's a very good and difficult question. Hard to give a short answer to. The first one is, I think actually the arguments that I've given so far have been mainly arguments for theism. I think on balance, it's very rational to be a theist. I think it's irrational to be an atheist. But if I believe that, there's one or two steps further you need to make in order before you know which God you would believe in, or even whether God would reveal himself to us. It's a different story that we don't have time for tonight. I'm happy to chat with you more about that. But I think that in Christianity, you have something which is both logically very compelling and existentially satisfying. It has the ring of truth to it in many different ways. But to make that argument, you need to ask yourself really important questions like, if God revealed himself to us in the Bible, for example, or most profoundly in Jesus Christ, is that reliable? I believe there's really good arguments for saying that those texts are reliable and the story there is reliable. If they're unreliable, that would be a problem. And you can build an argument from that. So the interesting thing is, it's relatively easy to talk about the question about whether theism or atheism is true. A harder question is to ask yourself, if theism is true, what does that mean for me? But you can turn around and say, if theism is true, then surely the most important question for all of us would be to ask ourselves, what would this creator want from us? It should be the search that we make the most important one in our lives. So because we're running out of time, I'm not going to give you all the reasons why I believe in Jesus Christ. But I want to urge you to search for that truth with all your heart, your soul, and your mind.
Okay. Yeah, I see still many hands, but I'm sorry that time is almost up or up. Thank you both for this very nice discussion, also in the way it went. Yeah, thank you for the presentations, and also thank you all in the audience for the very nice and good questions. And I give the floor now to the real chair of this meeting, and he will tell you about what is happening here after, and the rest of the evening, and tomorrow and the day after. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for hosting this discussion, Mr. Hellendoorn. And yeah, we want to thank you for speaking, for coming to the Netherlands, Mr. Louis, and yeah, for having a very interesting discussion with us, Mr. Hartmann. And now we also want to materialize our thanks. And we have some little presents for you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Again, thank you very much.
Yeah, so hopefully you can use it. You can put it on your desk. It's coffee or tea.
Delft
mug.
It's better than a Billy.
So yeah, I saw that there's a lot of questions from you. Thank you for that. Unfortunately, we have to stop here because the building closes in a while. And again, thank you, Mr. Louis, Mr. Hartmann, Mr. Hellendoorn, for being here and having this interesting discussion with us. We think that it's very important to discuss these big questions, to address them, also here at TU Delft. And I hope that you are inspired. And thank you for listening.